Why are we all so anxious so much of the time? I think that understanding the evolutionary root of our anxiety can be really helpful in figuring out how to recover and what we can do differently. I think it can also help us feel not so defective when we understand that our brains evolved in a very different environment than we live in now, and that there's a mismatch, and this mismatch causes a lot of our anxiety. So, if you think of an antelope living on a savanna, that antelope lives in an immediate return environment, which means that if it sees lions coming at it, it is going to run. It is an immediate response to an immediate threat. When that lion is prowling and beginning to attack, that antelope has no other thought, just run as fast as possible. And then when there are no threats, that antelope eats grass, right? Or drinks water, gets an immediate return from its behavior. For us humans, most of our problems are in the future. There is some type of delayed consequence of the actions that we are taking today. In order to eat, we don't just head to our lawns and munch on grass. We have to plan. We have to have a job. We get a paycheck. We go to the store. We have to prepare the food. Our brains evolved in an immediate return environment, which means that if there is any kind of threat or danger, our response is for that amygdala to fire. I have those videos on amygdala hijack, which I'll link at the end of this video. But our amygdala takes over. And in the face of immediate danger, a lion attacking us, we want that amygdala to take over. And the amygdala makes us fight, flee, or freeze. But as we've talked about on this channel, most of the threats we're facing today aren't immediately now. Longer term, we could see them possibly as life threatening. But our body is having all those chemical reactions of an immediate threat. So, a big difference between us and that antelope is that we have a more developed neocortex. Now, our neocortex, very, very useful in many ways. Without it, we actually couldn't live in a delayed return environment. And then also, probably the fact that we have a neocortex helped us develop this delayed return environment. But the neocortex is the part of our brain that does planning, that projects into the future, that helps us delay gratification, helps us problem solve. And this is super useful. So, the other thing to think about here, and probably, or maybe you've heard about thinking about animals that live in an immediate return environment and the fact that they don't tend to have anxiety disorders, right? Because they run and they release their stress in the moment when it's appropriate. But the other piece of this is that the antelope cannot predict into the future. After the antelope reaches safety, begins to munch on the grass, that antelope is not thinking, oh no, those lions are going to show up tomorrow. How do I prevent that? I can't prevent that. And get more and more anxious, right? So it is our ability to predict the future that actually creates our anxiety. So it's a combination of the fact that we live in the delayed return environment and we have this amazing predictive machine in our brain that can work too hard, that can develop all sorts of catastrophic stories. So, we're going to talk about how to get that neocortex to work for you, not to just fall into these patterns that are kind of working for the amygdala. They're kind of working for that fear center in your brain. So, anthropologists use these terms that are actually, to me, very interesting and useful. One is a delayed return environment, which is what we live in now. And the other is an immediate return environment, which the very first humans lived in. And most creatures prior to human beings lived in an immediate return environment. Reptiles evolved over 300 million years ago. Mammals evolved over 200 million years ago. Homo sapiens evolved 300,000 years ago. So that's already like a tiny slice of the entire evolution. And let's say we as humans have been living in a delayed return environment for about 500 years. That's about 0.17% of the time, right? It is a tiny fraction of the time that a relative of the human, right, of the human being that we know today has existed. So, in evolutionary terms, it's a really small amount of time that we've had to live in this delayed return environment, and our brains haven't changed. Or I should say, our brains haven't changed enough. But there are things you can do to change your own brain to make this adaptation. So we have this ability to predict into the future, which is a pro if we don't get totally lost in the story. When we get totally lost in the story, right, we're generating all the chemicals of that story, right? So we could be crying if we're thinking about something sad. We could have tears come to our eyes. It's not happening. We definitely have stress chemicals when we're thinking about anything stressful, and it's not happening. So, this is a reason why bringing your attention really into the present moment and trying to really absorb what's around you right now can really help calm down some of that overactive anxiety. And I'm going to follow this video with two, which are going to break this down for you more. One is going to focus on those made up stories, right? Which can be catastrophizing. We go to the worst case scenario. And the other is going to be on all the physical chemicals that get generated when we do that. So you have this brain that evolved to keep you safe. Number one priority is survival, right? So that's why the amygdala is so strong and can take over everything. And then as we go through life, we actually condition our brain to have fear responses in various situations. So, if something like very scary happens to you as a child, you have probably embedded way back in the subconscious mind some memory. It could be a smell, it could be a sight, it could be a sound with a fear reaction. Those get very closely linked. And then the other thing that happens when we're afraid of something, we very often avoid it. And that avoidance reinforces that fear. And we have repeated patterns of the behaviors that happen when we're scared of something, what that makes us think and feel, and these pathways become very strong. So habituation creates these really strong neural networks. But we can also change those. So we have neuroplasticity, our brains change throughout our lifetime, and we can actually begin to rewire some of the associations we make with certain situations, and we can rewire our brains not to have the fear response as long as we are fully convinced that it's not necessary. So, before I go on, if you haven't seen my free webinar, Rewire Your Brain for Joy and Confidence, I go into this kind of thing in more detail in terms of how to lower your anxiety, be more joyful by rewiring some of those neural networks. Put the link here, join. I think you'll find it useful. Okay. The last thing I want to say about our brains and personalities, maybe you can let me know what you think on that one. But we hate uncertainty. We really and truly dislike accepting uncertainty. So that contributes to our anxiety because we want to make sure everything works the way we want it to work. Now, if you are running from a tiger that's chasing you to eat you, you definitely want that to work, but it's very short lived. It either works or it doesn't work. And then the antelope has no real sort of memory or projection bringing that forward. But in a delayed return environment, there is enormous uncertainty because we are planning for things that are many days out, many weeks out, often many years out. Many things can change. There's a lot of uncertainty in a delayed return environment. And because our brain is so good at projecting those stories, we want to anticipate every possible angle that goes wrong. We want to come up with a solution for things that haven't happened yet. We want to think of every possibility rather than focusing on, okay, lots of uncertainty. I have to accept that. Well, what can I do now to improve things for the future? So, having our neocortex work for us is the what can I do now to improve things for the future? What can I do today that's productive? It still is working towards a goal. It is incorporating some element of what can go wrong, but it's what's my best shot? That's what I'm going to do today. So I want to outline for you, and I'm going to try to do this quickly, the skills that are needed in a delayed return environment versus the skills needed in an immediate return environment. So in a delayed return environment, we need adaptability and emotional regulation. Very, very important. We need impulse control, right? We need to be able to delay gratification. We need to be able to say, okay, I got to put a lot of hard work in, or I got to do this, which I don't really feel like doing now, but the goal is out there and that's what I'm looking for. So, impulse control, delayed gratification, super important in a delayed return environment. And remember, our brains weren't really made for that. And of course, we need problem solving. And problem solving really works best when we have our whole brain online, because that's when we can pull together our emotions, our memories, our understanding of the present situation, our view of the future. We have to bring all of that in. If our amygdala takes over and we're in that fight, flight, freeze, problem solving is not as productive. Problem solving requires creativity, critical thinking, and of course, decision making. In an immediate return environment, we need hypervigilance. We need situational awareness. We need to be aware of everything that is around us with a sense of urgency. We need to have very quick reactions. So, if you grew up in a home with a lot of crisis, right, you probably grew up really having to emphasize those immediate return skills, right? If there's a crisis happening, boom, you have to suppress your own needs, you have to jump into action, you have to immediately react. So, a typical situation for a parent could be, a 2-year-old who is running towards the stove and the pot's about to fall on him, and you've got to just boom, you can't really think and plan and all that. You need an immediate reaction, grab that kid. Same thing. If a kid who doesn't swim falls into the swimming pool, boom, you got to be there. So, immediate return requires that part of our brain that worked best in that environment to keep us safe. But if you grow up in that atmosphere, then it becomes even more habituated to be using those immediate return skills all the time. So, learning to strengthen the delayed return skills, emotional regulation. I have a number of videos on it, but basically learning to diaphragmatically breathe, learning to tell your body that what it is responding to in terms of a worry is not real. It's not happening. I don't need these chemicals. I can still think about that concern without these body chemicals. That's a part of emotional regulation. Super important. Faith in your own ability to be adaptable, because I know you have an ability to be adaptable, truly. A lot of us don't like to think of ourselves that way, but really, we are adaptable. Humans in general are adaptable. And individually, I'm sure you have a lot of examples of how adaptable you truly are. Strengthen the connection to that adaptability and actually strengthen the love of that adaptability. Know that that is what you can count on. If we can count on our own ability to adapt to different situations, we can lower our anxiety a lot. Okay, so how does it help to understand the difference between the immediate return environment, delayed return environment, and how our brains evolved? I actually think this is really empowering information because one, it highlights the disconnect between our very real worries and the fact that we don't need these anxiety chemicals. So that is number one. Fundamentally, we can separate these real life challenges from our body's chemical response. It takes time, but you can do it. And you get there with emotional regulation. Number two, I think this theory highlights that the distress is real. The distress that we feel with anxiety is real. We are actually having these physical reactions. They do not feel good and they make us panic about our survival. And it's just that that's way back here. It's not your fault. So the distress is real, not your fault. And three, really delving into it in terms of your own personal story, which is important, your own personal experiences of why the particular anxieties that you have developed can help you see how kind of the evolution of your brain combined with your particular experiences to wire your brain in a way that you are connecting particular situations, experiences, people, other beings, right? With fear and having that automatic, habituated fear and anxiety response. And then we have to bring in the concept that over time, the human brain has changed. And as we grow, our brain changes. And we can actually do things to help rewire that brain. Deliberate efforts to change how we are thinking or responding, the behaviors we're doing, can actually change the neuronal structure of your brain. All right, I hope this was helpful. Make sure to subscribe. Tune in next week. I'll put a couple of videos here that are very relevant for you to continue watching. And come back next week because I'm going to tackle two separate pieces of the cognitive, the thought patterns, and the somatic, the body feelings. Take care.